How soon after your father told you about the idea of sin eating did you know this was going to become a movie?
Oh, I mean, kind of right away, a little bit, because I was like, it was so sticky to me. Because based on the previous films that I've done, I've always liked to make movies and stories about like the haves and the have-nots, and the disparate nature of power, you know, when it comes to money, with people who have it and people who don't. So that immediately just like stuck with me. I'm like, this is what I want to write about. So I took it to my writing partner, and we just sort of started to think about like what would be a good, you know, way to make this movie. And we thought doing something, you know, modern day would be good. And then just looking and doing the research, because there was a lot of research that we did for that, finding that it went from, you know, Wales and England in the 1500s, and then it sort of came all the way into the US, you know, the whole concept of sin eating, and it got lost in the Appalachians in like the early like 1900s, and then it kind of disappeared. You know, like you don't hear about sin eating anymore. So we were like, okay, that's interesting. Like, where did it go? So that was kind of the genesis of thinking about if we were going to do it on modern day, you know, it's sort of this underground thing that maybe people have continued to do. And if so, where can we land, you know? And so we were thinking about different places in town, you know, like maybe Los Angeles, you know, or where in the country. And we landed on Chicago, just because the aesthetics of Chicago is great. You know, it's very much Gotham City, you know, for me, from like Nolan's films, which I really dig. But yeah, from there we just figured out what the story would be. It seemed like a really solid, you know, cautionary tale in a way. I don't know if you remember the movie Blank Check from back in the day. It was like a Disney movie.
Okay, yeah.
I think.
Mm-hmm, vaguely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, where it's like this kid gets, you know, this blank check, and he's able to do everything. He moves into a house, and there's hijinks and everything. And not to say that we made like a horror movie version of that, but like it sort of struck me a little bit that it's, you know, you've got this young construction worker who is living on his friend's couch. He's not getting by, and he is working at this mansion, sort of building something weird in the backyard. And the old man who is dying gives him this, you know, sort of offer, like, if you eat a meal off my dead body, I'll give you everything. And like, you know, it's a little weird, but how is he going to say no? You know, and then he gets everything that he wants. And then, of course, there's a dark side to that. So, you know, if you're taking on the sins of this person, you know, what have they done? And can it be, I don't know, can these sins turn into something real? You know, and that's where we thought, you know, sort of like 13 Ghosts, having ghosts of the sins, you know, come out and sort of start torturing and coming after this guy. So yeah, once we landed on that, we're like, that feels like a movie to us. And we kind of, you know, wrote the script and went from there.
Right. And there's something else powerful, and I don't want to give the spoilers away, but he also has a tie that from a precarious situation in his life that also kind of haunts him with this. So we'll just leave it at that. But in the beginning, you see what happens. Adam, what is a sin eater?
A sin eater is someone who takes on people's sins by eating a meal off of the deceased's corpse. And this is something that came, I think it was it was a real thing, but it came out long ago in like Welsh in England. And essentially, you know, a bunch of, villages or whatever, like smaller villages, they would, you know, have a sin eater come and eat a meal off the dead body because they were so religious that they thought that, you know, all of their sins needed to be, you know, eaten away.
And who is the one that they would choose as this sin eater?
They would choose essentially anybody who was like the most destitute in the town. So someone who, you know, could essentially be taken advantage of, someone who needed a meal, anybody who was willing to go in, you know, look at a dead body, go like, yeah, I'll eat a meal off of this. I'll take on your sins, you know, because they believe that to be true. And, you know, it's a pretty terrible thing, but people did do it.
And how did you hear about this relates back to what, the 1600s or whenever it was?
Yeah. Yeah, my dad actually is, he kind of like looks around and he's into like pagan rituals. Not that he does pagan rituals, but he's just interested in esoteric things. So in like 2017, he told me about, this concept of sin eating, and he was like, this could make an interesting movie. And I was like, yeah, you're right. I looked into it, and just the fact of, that really creepy thing that people would do, I was like, that's a really great thing to sort of hang a movie on and be a really good starting point for a story.
Why was this a story that you had to write?
I think it was because I did not grow up with a lot of money. Like, I grew up in Des Moines and a part of New Mexico, and my parents, teachers and sort of administrators, and like never really made that much money. So coming out eventually to Los Angeles and being around just the wealth that is kind of everywhere in a lot of pockets, it was really interesting to me, and that's why I kind of felt like the main character Rick. Where he's just like coming into this world and he's like, I don't really know how to act, and in some ways I still don't know how to act when around like big money or people with money. It's interesting. So that was sort of like at least my way into the story. And also the fact that if you're doing something like sin eating, religion is clearly something that we think had to be addressed. So grew up Catholic. And so there's a big, sort of Catholic, theme and religious theme, because like if you're taking on sins, in at least, the way that I understand it, like if you sin, you ask for forgiveness and that sin goes away, right? But what if you're taking on someone else's sins and you don't know what those sins are? And if you can't put yourself in that position where you didn't do it and you can't feel the remorse, then how can you get rid of it? So that's one of the little interesting narrative things that we do in the film.
Right, and also tying in the historical, I wasn't aware of sin eating, but it kind of reminds me of like, the witch trials.
Yeah.
They started in Europe and then they moved here, and sort of the fear around, alleged witches and things like that. So it has this really interesting sort of like historical reference to it.
Yeah.
And the house that you filmed in also feels such a heavy, fascinating character itself.
Yeah.
The mystery. So kudos for landing that location.
Thanks. Yeah. It was a great find, and it really worked for what we needed to. It was big, and a little gothic and imposing and dark. And it's like if you are, moving into an enormous house, an enormous grounds, all by yourself, and you have servants, like people who are there. Do they live there? Do they just work there? Maybe you don't know because the house is so big. Like, how does that feel, Because like you have all this space, you're kind of surrounded by people, but like you're pretty much alone in general. So like having that isolating feel is something that I hope the film accomplished.
It sure does, and in all these yes people, sort of yes people. But anyway, yeah, and just sort of everything's granted to him. Yeah, fascinating. Why do you love writing stories about imbalances, power imbalances between the rich and the poor, powerful and the sort of the working person?
I think because like I've just felt that through my entire life. I think a really specific example is when I was growing up, my dad used to work for companies and state agencies that would help rehabilitate newly blinded people. So I had, blind babysitters when I was younger. And so I was around the world of blind people, which a lot of people aren't. I would say the vast majority of people aren't. But I was able to sort of, be there and see that. And seeing how people would react to blind people walking around, they have the cane, they're navigating. But it was just sort of interesting to see that and, see how people reacted. And then growing up, I mean, maybe this is getting too personal, but I was always really small when I grew up, and I was bullied a bit. So, having that, made me feel a little bit on the back end, on the back foot, as it were. So, yeah, that's kind of why I think I'm just naturally attracted to it. And then seeing, the I guess the wealth disparity that has continued to grow, over the decades, since I've been growing up, and just seeing it. We all see it, there's always unrest about it, and, elections are made because of it. So, yeah, it's definitely one of those things that I've just always been attracted to.
Right, and in LA, there's such a need to keep up sort of appearances,
Yeah.
and so we don't really know who is actually wealthy, who's just appearing wealthy. So yeah, it's an interesting thing here in
and I think
Los Angeles.
and I think social media has exacerbated that exponentially, because everybody can put on, their screen what the ideal life is that they're living.
Right.
And it can be totally falsified. So, that makes people feel bad or whatever, but like, it's just the creation of this facade.
How did you write this big idea to a budget level where the movie could be made?
That's a really good question. We kind of swung for the fences, to be honest. When we first wrote it, we didn't really know what the budget would be, but we had a lot of locations. If you're setting a movie in the world of opulence, like, you have to find a way to show that. So obviously, that probably costs money from a production side. So when we first wrote it, we're just like, let's write the best version of the script that we want to see. And then if we're ever able to find, investors, because at the time we had no idea. Like, we were writing it completely on spec, and it was just that sort of hope that, well, somebody will see something in this script like we do. And it took a while, but we found, some creative collaborators who really did, and they were able to, get the financing for it and everything. And we're like, great, let's do it. And then the realities of production sort of set in. It's like, you have this amount of money, what can we do to sort of get it in that budget? So we had to cut a few things, that we couldn't realistically shoot, but we were able to fold it into the script in a lot of good ways. And I think we did some condensing and, some really powerful stuff. And I think that always happens when you're sort of put against the wall, in terms of like, all right, like, you got to reach this number. What can you cut? And you don't just want to cut stuff out. You want to be able to integrate that stuff in there, because it's not just a scene or a sequence or a scare. There's the character's arc. There's, the themes, the meaning. You have to find a way to sort of integrate that throughout. So the rewriting process on it, once, we got the producers on board, was great. And working with the director, I think, was fantastic, because Justin had a lot of great ideas. And, the three of us were able to really, just sit down, bang it out, and get it into a place that budgetarily we could do, which I think, looking at the movie based on the budget and what it looks like, I think we did a lot for what the budget actually is, because it looks like a way better movie, way bigger movie than I think people would realize based on the budget. So, I'm proud of the team for being able to do that. And also, from a production logistics standpoint, you have to have, producers that can strike deals with people, get people who are excited about, your project. Maybe they have a bunch of cars that they want to lend you, like a Rolls Royce or whatever. Right. Maybe that happens. Or people with a great house, and people that just want to work and believe in it and sort of help you out. So that's connections and luck, and having the right people, sort of leading the charge in those areas.
Are there tax credits in Illinois?
Yeah, there are. Chicago, Illinois does have some tax credits. So yeah, we were able to take advantage of that.
And also, too, maybe not, and this is nothing against California, but being in another state where maybe they were more embracing of film just because there's less production there? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Chicago's a big hub, like they shoot a lot of stuff, but they're very welcoming. to films. You know, and the Midwest, I'm seeing that a lot more. You know, this sort of, you know, what they call the flyover states. Like they're doing a lot of good stuff in terms of like incentives and filming out there, and the crews out there are great. I got to say, the crew that we had in Chicago was a dream. Like everybody we worked with, they were so great. I really, really loved working with that crew because they were rad. So, but I think that is kind of just in general, and I know everybody talks about that, it's just the incentives for California just are not good enough to keep productions here, just in general, for most budget levels, you know? So when we're, you know, looking at locations, you know, it's kind of never, well, where in LA can we do it? Which is sad for the people that like live here, you know? It's cool when you get to travel and spend like 5 weeks in Chicago, like that's pretty rad, but also, you know, it would be nice to be able to shoot stuff, you know, in your backyard, in your home, in a way.
Sure, and if I read correctly, I know the powers that be are working on new plans. I don't know where they are with that, but hopefully we can come to something soon.
Yeah, I hope so.
But and I love the backdrop of Chicago, the different scenes. I thought that was really interesting because I don't always see that. You know, you think of great wealth and sort of fast living as you know, LA or New York. So
yeah, and Chicago really, unfortunately, they do have that sort of like wealth disparity, you know, with the areas that are really poor and the areas that are really rich, and they're pretty close together. So that was one of the reasons why we decided to set, you know, the story of Sin Eater there. And also just because of, you know, the look of the city. You know, it's a great looking city.
Yeah.
You know, it's got a lot of history, you know, like visually it's fantastic.